The stars were scattered across the void like cold, distant diamonds. Silence, absolute and all-encompassing. A vast emptiness, broken only by the irregular hum of a ship's engine spiraling toward the barren world below. Inside the wreckage, the human warlord known as Kaelen, the feared conqueror of countless systems, the man who commanded entire legions with a single glare, lay unconscious, gravely wounded. His ship had been crippled by a sudden, unexpected attack. An enemy he couldn't see, one that had slipped past his defenses like a shadow in the night. The once pristine craft now lay scattered across the rocky terrain of a planet that had been forgotten by time. The air was thin, the winds dry, and everything around him felt lifeless. Kaelen was not accustomed to weakness. His body was a finely honed weapon, a machine of war built to withstand the harshest of punishments. But even he was no match for the savage blow he'd taken. Blood stained his armor, his face, his hands. He barely clung to life as his world slipped into darkness. In the distance, there was movement, a shadow against the blinding sun. At first, Kaelen thought it was some kind of mirage, his mind playing tricks on him, deceived by the heat, the blood loss, or the exhaustion. But no, it was real. Something was approaching. She was an alien, her skin a deep shade of violet, adorned with strange, intricate markings that glowed faintly under the sun. Her eyes, a striking shade of silver, were filled with a mix of caution and curiosity. She wore ragged, worn-out clothes, likely the remnants of whatever masters had abandoned her here, stranded on this dead world. Around her neck, there was a collar, a symbol of her past. A collar that was broken, no longer serving its purpose, but still a reminder of the chains she once wore. She knelt beside him, hesitating for only a moment before reaching out to touch his face, feeling the coolness of his skin and the steady rhythm of his breath. Kaelen's eyes fluttered open, though they struggled to focus. His vision was blurry, and his body screamed in pain, but he still managed to growl. You are the one who saved me?" She didn't respond immediately, instead tending to his wounds with an efficiency that suggested she had done this many times before. Her hands moved expertly, cleaning the blood, applying a salve of some kind, and wrapping his torso in makeshift bandages. Every action she took was a reminder of the power she held despite her fragile appearance. She had the strength to heal him, to keep him alive. She was his savior, yet her eyes held no gratitude, no desire for recognition. It was as if she were simply performing a task, like one would tend to an injured animal. The warlord frowned at the thought. "Who are you?" Kaelen asked, his voice rough, as his strength slowly returned. The alien woman's eyes flicked up to meet his. "I am no one," she said, her voice soft but steady, carrying a weight of untold sorrow. "Just a slave." "A slave?" Kaelen repeated, confusion mixing with a growing sense of empathy. It was clear that whatever her past had been, it had left its mark. There was a resilience in her, but also a hollow sadness, a void that ran deep. "I was abandoned," she continued, her gaze drifting toward the horizon as though she could see beyond the world around her. "When my masters were finished with me, they left me here. Alone." Kaelen's mind raced. An abandoned alien slave. He had heard stories of the brutality of alien masters, of their disregard for the lives of those they enslaved. He had fought many wars, crushed rebellions, and watched as entire civilizations were bent to his will. But this was different. He knew that the cruelty of her situation was a stain on the galaxy itself. With a deep breath, he shifted his weight, pushing through the pain as he propped himself up. His eyes locked with hers, intensity, determination, a fire that refused to be extinguished. "I swear this then," he said, voice firm despite his weakened state. "You are no longer a slave. You are free, and I will make sure that you are more than just a survivor." She turned her head slightly, her silver eyes searching his face, as if trying to discern if he was lying or telling the truth. Kaelen didn't flinch, didn't waver. There was something about her, something that spoke to him in ways he couldn't explain. He had never been one for kindness, never been one to offer anything without expecting something in return, But this woman, this alien who had shown him mercy when no one else would, deserved more. Her former masters had cast her aside, but Kaelen would make them pay for it. He didn't know how or when, but he would take her with him, and he would make her a queen, not just of a kingdom, but of her own fate. "Come with me," he urged, offering a hand to her. "There is a place for you, by my side." Her gaze softened, though there was still hesitation in her eyes. She didn't speak at first, and for a moment, Kaelen thought she might refuse. But then, as if drawn by the promise of something more, something beyond survival, she placed her hand in his. "I will follow," she said quietly. The days that followed were a blur of pain and survival. Kaelen's wounds slowly healed, his body regaining its strength under the alien woman's careful hands. She never spoke of her name, and he never asked. He knew it wasn't necessary. The bond between them was unspoken, forged in the fire of a shared struggle, an understanding that transcended words. She cared for him, without expectation, without hesitation. Kaelen was no stranger to loyalty. He had inspired it in his soldiers, in his enemies even. But this was different. The quiet strength she exuded, the way she moved with purpose and precision, it made him realize something about himself that he had never considered. The price of his victories. How many lives had he destroyed in his quest for power? How many had he cast aside, just as her masters had done to her? He found himself thinking about that more and more. There was no doubt he had built an empire, a vast kingdom of conquered worlds, but what had it all been for? To rule over a galaxy of broken people? To command a force that only knew destruction? Was that all his legacy would be? And here, on this forsaken planet, was the one person who had the potential to change everything. His heart had begun to stir, not just with admiration for her survival, but with something deeper, something he couldn't quite name. It was more than just gratitude. It was the recognition that she had the power to be something more than what the galaxy had decided for her. And so, as the days passed, as the sun rose and set on the desolate world they now called home, Kaelen made a decision. He would take her with him. He would return to his kingdom, to the heart of his empire, and he would change everything. She was no longer just a slave, no longer a mere survivor. She would be more. She would be his equal. But as Kaelen recovered and prepared for their departure, the weight of his decision began to settle on him. It was one thing to take a woman from a distant planet and call her his queen in the privacy of his mind. But what would it mean to the galaxy? What would it mean to his soldiers, his allies, and especially to his enemies? The universe would not simply accept this woman by his side without resistance. He was ready for that fight. He had fought wars before, built empires with blood and fire, and crushed anyone who dared oppose him. But this was different. She was different. And so, as Kaelen steadied himself, preparing for their journey to his kingdom, the silence between them began to shift. The alien woman, who had tended to him like a ghost, like a shadow of a life long lost, finally spoke. You're going to take me with you?" Her voice was a whisper, but it carried a weight of disbelief. He turned to her, his expression softening for the first time in days. "Yes, I will take you back, to my kingdom, and I will make you my queen." Her eyes widened slightly, as though she couldn't fathom the words he was saying. It wasn't just the shock of the offer. It was the idea that someone would see her, truly see her, for what she was, a warrior in her own right. Not the broken slave her masters had created, not the abandoned woman they had discarded, but something far more. "I was never meant for such things," she said quietly, almost to herself. "My purpose was to serve, to obey." Kaelen stepped closer, closing the space between them. "That was their purpose for you, not yours. You are not a servant. You are a queen, and I will make sure the galaxy knows it." The words were simple, but they carried a weight of promise, of something Kaelen had never offered to anyone. His word, his trust, his belief in her. She stared at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face, as though looking for the truth in the lines of his expression. And after what felt like an eternity, she finally nodded. "Then I will follow. I will be by your side." And just like that, an unspoken bond was formed between them, a promise of loyalty, of something more than just a conqueror and his conquest. It was the beginning of something new. The journey back to his kingdom was not an easy one. Kaelen had been out of commission for weeks, his ship barely functional. They navigated through asteroid fields, fought off the occasional band of space pirates, and barely made it through a few close calls with dangerous space anomalies. But with each passing day, Kaelen found himself more and more convinced of the truth of his decision. She was by his side, steady and unwavering, her quiet strength now a pillar upon which he leaned. As they approached his homeworld, the last of his doubts began to fade. His kingdom was a marvel, towering cities, vast fleets of ships, and armies of the fiercest soldiers in the galaxy. But beneath the surface of all the power, the opulence, the riches, there were cracks that had formed in Kaelen's heart, in his mind, in his very soul. And now, as they landed in the heart of his empire, he felt something shift inside him. The world around him, so familiar, felt foreign in the presence of the woman who had healed him. The warlord who had once ruled with fear, with iron fists and blood-soaked swords, now stood before the galaxy, ready to present a new vision. He led her through the grand halls of his palace, where his generals, advisors, and sycophants watched in silence. They had been expecting his return, expecting the usual celebrations, the usual displays of power. But when they saw her, when they saw the woman standing at his side, there was a collective gasp. She was an alien. Her markings, her broken collar, her presence, all of it was a stark contrast to the grandiosity of Kaelen's kingdom. His generals exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of what to make of the new woman who stood beside their leader. But Kaelen did not hesitate. He moved forward, placing his hand on her shoulder as he addressed the assembly of his court. "This is my queen," he declared, his voice booming across the room, filled with power and authority. "Her name is not important to you yet. What matters is this: she is my equal, and from this day forward, she will rule beside me." The room fell silent. It wasn't a gesture of diplomacy or a symbolic act to appease the people. It was Kaelen's truth. The galaxy had feared him for years, and now they would fear the woman who had stood beside him, the woman who had risen from the ashes of her broken past to become something far greater. They would fear her because she was not just a survivor. She was a force to be reckoned with. The tension in the room was palpable, thick with disbelief, but Kaelen didn't care. He had made his choice. She was his queen, and together, they would shape the future of his empire. But their journey was far from over. Her former masters, the ones who had cast her aside, would not let her go easily. They had enemies, powerful enemies, and they would stop at nothing to reclaim what they believed was theirs. But Kaelen was no fool. He would not be intimidated. He had already conquered so much, and he would stop at nothing to protect what was his. The galaxy would change, and Kaelen and his queen would lead it into a new age. As the days wore on, the tension in Kaelen's court only grew. His generals and advisors were, to put it mildly, unsettled. The news of Kaelen's decision had spread like wildfire through the corridors of power, reaching the farthest corners of his empire. Some were curious, some were fearful, and some were outright hostile, but no one dared openly challenge Kaelen's authority. At least, not yet. The warlord had always ruled with an iron fist, his reputation more than enough to silence most opposition. But this was something different. His court had never known a woman like her, a slave turned queen, a mysterious alien with strange markings and a past so dark it could swallow entire star systems. Her presence was a challenge to everything they believed in. They had spent years bowing to Kaelen's will, living in the comfort of his dominance, and now, suddenly, their world was being upended. Still, Kaelen stood firm. He had fought and bled for this empire, and he would not allow anyone to dictate the terms of his rule, not even his most trusted advisors. "I want nothing less than complete loyalty," Kaelen said, his voice low, yet filled with the cold certainty that had earned him his place as the galaxy's most feared warlord. "If anyone here has a problem with my decision, speak now." The silence that followed was thick. His generals shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting to one another, but no one spoke. Kaelen looked to the woman standing beside him, his queen, and for a brief moment, his gaze softened. She met his eyes and nodded, a quiet understanding passing between them. This wasn't just his battle to fight anymore. It was theirs, together. And then the silence broke. A voice, low and calculated, rose from the back of the room. It was Commander Thorn, one of Kaelen's oldest and most trusted generals. His voice carried the weight of authority, and he had never once questioned Kaelen's decisions before. Lord Kaelen, Thorn began, stepping forward. His expression was stern, his posture unwavering. We all know your power is unmatched, but what you're proposing is dangerous. Kaelen's gaze hardened. He had expected this. Thorn had always been pragmatic, a man who valued tradition, stability, and the familiar order of things. You are suggesting we accept an alien, a woman who was once a slave, as our queen? Thorn continued, his voice laced with disbelief. What will the people think? What will our allies think? And our enemies? How do you plan to face them, knowing they will see this as a weakness? They will see us as divided. Kaelen stepped forward, his figure towering over the room. His eyes locked onto Thorn's, cold as steel. Do you think I care what our enemies think? Kaelen's voice was like a thunderclap, his presence consuming the room. I have crushed entire armies, shattered kingdoms, and bent galaxies to my will. I do not answer to them. I answer only to myself. And to her. He turned to the woman beside him, his queen. She had remained quiet, observing the unfolding discussion with calm composure. She did not flinch at Thorn's words. Instead, she met the commander's gaze with unwavering confidence, a subtle strength radiating from her. You will not question her, Kaelen continued, his tone final. If any of you doubt her worth, then you doubt me. The room fell silent once again, the air thick with tension. Thorn's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing more. He knew better than to challenge Kaelen directly. There was a quiet acceptance in the room, but it was one born of fear and uncertainty. Kaelen turned back to his queen, his voice softening. Are you ready for this? He asked, his tone gentle, though still firm. Are you ready to stand beside me, not just as my equal, but as the queen of this empire? She nodded, her silver eyes meeting his with a depth of understanding that went beyond words. I am ready. With that, Kaelen motioned for the court to disperse. But the battle for his kingdom had only just begun. There were many who would challenge him, who would not accept the new order he was creating. The galaxy was vast, filled with powerful factions, ruthless leaders, and ancient rivalries. Some would be content to let him rule, but others would see his decisions as an invitation to chaos. Weeks passed, and Kaelen's decision to make her his queen was met with a mixture of admiration and growing fear across his empire. Those who had once pledged their loyalty to him were now forced to confront the reality of the changes he was making. It was one thing to conquer planets and crush rebellions. It was another to change the very foundation of his rule. In the shadows, whispers began to spread. The alien queen, once a slave, was seen as a threat by some of Kaelen's closest allies. There were rumors that certain factions were plotting against him, using her as a way to destabilize his rule. His enemies, sensing an opportunity, were already moving in the dark, gathering forces for a war that Kaelen could not yet see. But Kaelen was not blind to the danger. His mind was always 3 steps ahead. He knew that there would be opposition, not just from within his own court, but from the other power players in the galaxy. He had seen the way some of his generals had looked at his queen. He had heard the subtle murmur of discontent among his people. The woman who had once been abandoned, discarded like an object, now stood as the beacon of his empire's future. She was the symbol of his reign, a queen who had earned her place beside him, not through birthright, but through strength. As Kaelen and his queen moved deeper into the political landscape of his empire, it became clear that their bond would be tested. Old enemies, some of whom had once been allies, were beginning to take notice. They could not allow a decision like this to go unchallenged. They would not accept a human warlord and his alien queen. To them, it was an abomination. But Kaelen was not one to back down. He had spent his life conquering, building, and ruling. He had learned the art of war like no one else. He would not lose his empire, not to anyone, and certainly not because of her. Their first test came in the form of the Kryeth, a powerful race of merciless warriors who had once been Kaelen's allies in the conquest of a distant star system. The Kryeth had always respected strength, but they had no love for weakness, and they had already begun to question Kaelen's judgment. The Kryeth's fleet arrived in Kaelen's system, their warships dark against the stars. They came not with the intent to negotiate, but to demand answers. It was not a threat Kaelen would ignore. He knew what must be done. He called for his generals, his council, and his queen. Together, they would face the storm. Together, they would show the galaxy that Kaelen was not a man to be challenged. And together, they would prove that she, his queen, was not a thing to be discarded, but the heart of his empire. The stars stretched before them, vast and infinite. The warlord and his queen stood together at the helm of his flagship, staring down the approaching Kryeth fleet. The moment of reckoning had come. Their enemies would either bow before them, or they would be crushed. And Kaelen knew, as he looked at the woman beside him, that no matter the outcome, they would face it together. She had saved him. Now, he would protect her, and together, they would reshape the galaxy. As Kaelen and his queen stood side by side, gazing out over the vast expanse of space, the Kryeth fleet loomed closer. Their ships, black as night, formed an impenetrable wall, casting a shadow over the entire system. The warlord's eyes narrowed, calculating, sizing up the threat before him. The Kryeth had come to challenge him, to test his resolve, and Kaelen would give them exactly what they were looking for. "We don't need to fight," Kaelen murmured, his voice low. "But if it's a fight they want, then it's a fight they'll get." His queen stood silent next to him, her posture calm, but the tension in her was palpable. She had never once faltered in her support of him, even when his empire's fate had seemed uncertain. But she could feel it now, the weight of what was about to happen. This wasn't just a battle for power. This was a battle for everything they had built, for the future they would create together. "I trust you," she whispered, her voice steady, unwavering. "Whatever comes, we face it together." And it was with that unspoken bond, that shared strength, that Kaelen took the first step toward the future. He activated the comms, speaking directly to the Kryeth commander who was leading the fleet, his voice ringing out across the stars. "This is Kaelen, warlord of the known galaxy and rightful ruler of this star system," he declared. "I demand an explanation for your aggression." The silence on the other end of the comms was suffocating. Kaelen's reputation was known far and wide, and the Kryeth had never once questioned his authority. But now, there was a change in the air, an unsettling shift in the balance of power. The Kryeth commander's voice crackled through the speaker, cold and dispassionate. "Kaelen, you are a fool. You have made an enemy of the Kryeth by allowing a mere slave, an alien with no true value, to stand beside you as your queen. You have dishonored yourself, and we will not let this weakness go unpunished." Kaelen's lips curled into a smirk. "Weakness? No, this is strength, and it is time you learned the difference." With a single motion, he gave the order. His fleet, loyal to him through every victory, every conquest, sprang into action. Warships, sleek and powerful, launched from the hangars, engaging the Kryeth fleet with brutal precision. Kaelen's flagship remained at the heart of the chaos, his hands steady on the controls, as the battle raged on. It wasn't just the ships that fought. It was the very essence of his empire, his identity, his bond with her. The galaxy had always known Kaelen as a ruthless conqueror, a warlord who commanded armies with fear. But now, he was fighting for something far greater than his own ambitions. He was fighting for his queen, for the woman who had saved him when no one else would. As the battle unfolded, it became clear that the Kryeth had underestimated him. They had expected Kaelen to back down, to retreat, to cower before the challenge they presented. Instead, they found themselves facing a force far more formidable than they had imagined. The Kryeth commander was no fool. He had once been an ally of Kaelen's, and he knew exactly how ruthless the warlord could be when pushed to the edge. But he had believed that Kaelen's decision to name an alien slave his queen would fracture his empire, divide his loyalties. What he had not anticipated was the unshakable unity between Kaelen and his queen, a unity that radiated out to every soldier, every ally who stood with them. Hours passed in the chaos of battle, the fate of the galaxy hanging in the balance. The Kryeth fleet, once imposing and powerful, began to falter under the onslaught of Kaelen's forces. Ships were destroyed, torn apart by Kaelen's strategy and relentless aggression. The Kryeth, once a formidable force, were now on the back foot. Kaelen's voice rang out through the comms again, this time with the weight of finality. "Commander," he said, his tone cold and commanding, "you have failed. Your fleet is broken, your forces scattered. Surrender now, or face the consequences." The Kryeth commander, his pride shattered, knew there was nothing left to do. The Warlord had won again, and this time, he had done it with more than just the might of his armies. He had done it with the strength of his convictions, the power of the woman at his side. With a heavy heart, the commander relented, ordering his fleet to retreat. The battle was over. In the aftermath of the conflict, Kaelen stood on the bridge of his flagship, looking out over the debris of the destroyed Kryeth fleet. The victory was his, but the cost had been high. The galaxy would not forget this day, nor would they forget the woman who had helped him secure it. His queen stood beside him, her presence like a steady flame in the storm. The battle was over, but their war for the galaxy was just beginning. Kaelen knew that many more would come for them, seeking to challenge their power, their rule. But they were ready. Kaelen turned to his queen, his eyes meeting hers. There were no words spoken between them, but in that moment, they understood each other perfectly. This wasn't just about power, it was about the future. Their future. Together. "You were right," Kaelen said softly, his voice a rare mix of tenderness and resolve. "We face this world together." She nodded, her expression serene. "And together, we will shape it into something new." In the weeks that followed, Kaelen's enemies learned that he was not a man to be taken lightly. His empire, once a fractured collection of conquered planets, now stood united, its strength forged not just through fear, but through something deeper, a bond between two beings who had risen from the ashes of their pasts to create something far greater. But the galaxy was vast, and not all would accept the new order. There would be those who would continue to plot against them, who would try to tear their empire apart. But Kaelen and his queen stood strong, facing every challenge together. The warlord who had once ruled through fear, through fire and blood, was now a king, no longer alone, no longer bound by the chains of his own ambition. And at his side, his queen stood as his equal, a force in her own right. Together, they would shape the galaxy into something new, something no one had ever imagined. And those who dared to stand against them would soon learn that not even the stars could burn brighter than the fire they kindled.